Hi guys, so in this lecture we are going to be talking about speciation. We're going to have it in 3 different parts. The first 2 parts we're actually going to talk about what is actually a species, and the last part of the lecture we'll get into the actual process of the formation of new species, which is speciation. So for this first module, this first part of the lecture, we're going to use an example to explore this notion of how surprisingly difficult it can be to actually define what is a species. So we've got here on our slides, we've got an aerial photograph of the Galapagos Islands, made famous of course by Charles Darwin. And on these islands, there's been a lot of research, in particular on the ground finches, which Darwin's namesake, so Darwin ground finches. And we have here Daphne major, which has been a particular hotspot for research by researchers who've been tracking the population of a single species on this island, the medium ground finch, for the last 30 to 40 years. And it's a really nice, wonderful example of long-term ecological research, but also how you can actually see evolution in action in contemporary timescales, so over a 30 to 40 year period. So in the process of doing this long-term monitoring program in 1981, the researchers observed this rather unusual individual amongst the population. It was quite different in terms of its coloration, its general size, and its just general morphology was unusual, and they tagged it like they did with all the other birds. And they tracked all the descendants from this particular individual for the next 28 to 30 years. And what ended up happening is the researchers discovered that that single individual was an immigrant of the same species but on a neighboring island of Santa Cruz, which is only 10 kilometers away. Now, over the course of this 28 to 30 years, we find that we'll blow up our immigrant descendant here. So these 2 photographs here you see on the screen, the one in the background, the big one, is a descendant from the original single immigrant, which was a male. And the one down in the corner there is actually what the medium ground finch looks like on that population on Daphne major. So you can see that there is still differences in general appearance and morphology. But if you actually get down to the nitty-gritty, you'll see that it's not only just the general appearance, but there are some fundamental differences between the descendants of that single immigrant that is of the same species from the neighboring island of Santa Cruz, again only 10 kilometers away, and the resident descendants. So the first data screen that we have there is the size of the beaks. Now the beak is important for these finches because it determines the types of resources, food resources, that these birds feed on. The bigger the beak, the more hardy seeds that those individuals can crack open, but as a compromise they can't get to the more finer seeds if they have a smaller beak. So there are pros and cons depending on the size of the beak. And you can see here that the resident beaks are generally a lot smaller than the descendants from that single immigrant. And we also can look at the song. Now, song is important for these animals because of courtship. It determines who mates with who. So depending on the type of courtship song that you have will determine what sort of mates that you're going to attract. And you can see that the resident song and the immigrant song are actually quite different, and if you were actually to hear them, you would hear that they were sounding quite different. Now, the reason why I'm using this as an example as how to define a species is because, as I said, both of these birds, the original immigrant going back in 1981 and the resident species on Daphne major, are all classified as the same species. But the question now is, after 30 years of the descendant having mated with the residents on that island, but producing their own offspring, and you can see that there is this divergence in both morphology in terms of the beak, but also their behavior in terms of that courtship, which is going to be important for segregating individuals in that population. At what point do we decide that this bird and its descendants is a different species? So in the second part of the lecture, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how do we define a species. But I want you to think about this example as we go through part 2.